All right, guys, so here we go for video number 3 for chapter 22, where we're going to be talking about the tumultuous time period of China in the 1800s. So if the 19th century was a rough one for the Ottoman and Russian empires, it was really rough for China and the Qing dynasty. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, China maintained a trade surplus with the Western world and believed the rest of the world needed them more than they needed the rest of the world. This condescending and arrogant attitude pretty much blew up in their faces big time with the Opium War. Now, by the mid-18th century, foreign merchants could only trade in the southern city of Guangzhou. Right? You see it on a modern-day map. It's very close to where present-day Hong Kong is. That was it. And you notice it's a far way away from Beijing, the capital. So for British merchants, French merchants, Americans, and so forth, they were not allowed anywhere near the capital. They could only go into Guangzhou. Everything was really tightly regulated by Chinese officials, and there wasn't a strong demand for European goods. So, there wasn't much that they could do. European merchants figured that they need to find alternative ways to make a profit. And they found this in opium. Now, the British East India Company grew opium in India and shipped it to China, where it was exchanged for silver. Right? You'd see opium dens like the one in this picture that would pop up all throughout China. While the opium trade was lucrative, it was also illegal. However, corrupt Chinese authorities failed to enforce the law for decades, and the opium trade expanded. It got so bad that the Chinese government eventually banned the importing of opium. The British, like all drug dealers, obviously didn't want to stop selling opium, and eventually war broke out. Angry British merchants showed the influence they had over their government by convincing Britain to send the military to open up the opium trade again. This conflict, known as the Opium War, showed how far behind the Chinese were compared to industrialized Europe. Britain's modern navy easily handled the Chinese, and British rifles outgunned Chinese muskets. The most glaring disparity, though, was shown by Britain's ability to travel up the Grand Canal and Yangtze River using steamships to strike at China's interior. China had no answer for this, and it forced them to surrender. China soon found itself at the mercy of not only Britain, but other industrialized nations, who imposed a series of unequal treaties on China. The first was the Treaty of Nanjing, which gave extraterritoriality to British citizens in China, just like they had in the Ottoman Empire with the capitulations. It also forced China to open up more ports to British merchants and gave Britain control of Hong Kong. Now, other countries followed suit and forced China to sign similar treaties, where China continually got the lousy end of the bargain. This decline in status would culminate in China being carved into spheres of influence. Now, you see in the political cartoon how they're making kind of the metaphor they use is literally carving it up, where you've got the different powers. You've got Germany, you've got Britain, you've got Russia, you've got the Japanese as well. Not sure who this person in the red hat, possibly French. And you see China in the background, representative of the Qing dynasty with the Manchu, with the style, with the Fu Manchu mustache and the long braid in the back. But literally, that is what they did. Okay, China was powerless to resist the demands of foreign nations who wanted exclusive rights to trade and natural resources in certain areas. Now, this was mostly done by Europeans, but as I just said, Japan got involved as well. Right? You look at the different regions. You've got the French region, you've got the British regions, you've got Russia up here in the top, and also the Japanese. The Japanese controlled Korea. China was not able to hold on to its tributary states, such as what would eventually be Vietnam when controlled to the French. Korea went to the Japanese, and so forth. Now, the decay of China wasn't only due to foreign conflicts. It was also a result of internal problems, most notably the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion started as a local peasant uprising, but grew to encompass almost the entire country, and it almost toppled the Qing dynasty. It started with this guy, Hung, and I'm going to try to pronounce her name as best I can, Xiu Quan. Hung was a village school teacher who came to believe that God had called for him to destroy the Qing dynasty. His radical message appealed to many in China who were unhappy with Qing rule, mostly because the Qing were not technically Chinese, you remember. They were Manchus. He also called for reforms such as getting rid of public property, improving the status of women, and better education for the peasants. Now, Hong and his followers eventually captured the city of Nanjing and renamed it Taiping, meaning Great Peace, which was very ironic because this time period was anything but peaceful. It cost millions and millions of lives. Eventually, these forces threatened the cities of both Beijing and Shanghai, and the rebellion was finally put down in 1864, but not without devastating cost to China. Accurate records are tough to come by, but it's estimated that through fighting, famine, and disease, the rebellion claimed to as much as 20 to 30 million lives. It led to drastic declines in agriculture and severely weakened China. So between the aggressive foreigners and domestic disasters, the Qing government recognized that reforms were necessary. But unfortunately, this would in turn lead to rebellion. They went back to the basics and tried to establish a government based on Confucian principles while also adopting foreign technology to strengthen the military. An example is this movement called the self-strengthening movement. Between 1860 and 1895, the Qing government sought to blend Chinese cultural traditions with European industrial technology. Although it laid a foundation for industrialization, most of the changes didn't really reach very far. It didn't go far enough to bring real military or economic change. And as China struggled to resist further foreign control, it tried another attempt at reform with the 100 Days Reform. The leaders of this movement realized that keeping an agrarian society while trying to modernize was impossible. It also tried to do away with a lot of the old government ways. They wanted to turn China into a constitutional monarchy like Britain, and also to expand civil liberties. These reforms were backed by the young emperor, but they were looked at as too radical for members of his household and the old school nobility. The emperor was actually thrown in jail and the reforms were scrapped. Even though they were shot down, the reform attempts were seen as dangerous by many in China, and they were blamed on foreign influence. This led to an uprising known as the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion was a radical nationalist movement in China meant to drive out the foreign devils. Supported by members of the imperial family, the Boxers, and they were called this because foreigners didn't understand what these guys were doing with their traditional martial arts, so they just kind of referred to them as boxers. But these guys, they went out and they targeted foreigners. They killed foreigners, they killed Christians, and anyone who even did business with foreigners. It was a quasi-religious movement. Members believed that their native martial arts were superior to foreign weapons, and the weapons couldn't hurt them. You can guess how this is going to end. In 1900, a coalition force of British, French, Russian, U.S., German, and even Japanese troops quickly crushed the Boxer movement. The failure of the rebellion was yet another embarrassment for the Qing dynasty. It never really recovered, and in 1912, the last Qing emperor abdicated the throne. So, quick overview of the tumultuous time period in China, and then for the fourth and final video for this, we're going to talk about Japan and how Japan went through an awful lot of change and overhaul, but they decided to go about it in a much different way than China.